Somewhere in the Neolithic world, a human watched a calf drink from its mother and reached a conclusion that was either brilliant, desperate, or the beginning of a very long argument with the digestive system. The cow had not offered a sample. There was no label, no refrigeration, and no reassuring picture of a green field on the container. Yet eventually somebody collected the liquid and drank it. We will never know that person's name, village, or facial expression during the first swallow. Archaeology can preserve bones, pottery, fats, teeth, and the occasional terrible decision, but it does not preserve the minutes of the meeting in which a community discussed milking a cow. What it can tell us is when dairying became visible, why it probably made sense, and why the first successful version was almost certainly more complicated than one fearless adult holding a bowl beneath an animal. The story begins after people had already started domesticating cattle in Southwest Asia. These early animals descended from aurochs, enormous wild cattle that looked less like farm equipment and more like a reason to reconsider farming. Domestication changed them over generations, but the first herders were not dealing with modern dairy cows bred to stand calmly while a machine performs an extremely personal industrial procedure. They were managing powerful animals with horns, opinions, and no interest in supporting culinary innovation. Still, once cattle lived near people, the opportunity became difficult to ignore. A slaughtered animal provides meat once. A living female can provide calves, manure, labor in later farming systems, and milk during lactation. That does not mean early herders instantly understood the full business model. It means they had daily access to an obvious clue. Calves grew by drinking something produced by the cow. Humans are very good at observing another species' private arrangement and asking whether it can be scaled. The first attempts were probably not random acts of udder-related courage. Herders already needed to understand breeding, birth, calf behavior, and the moods of individual animals. They may have learned that milk flows more readily when a calf begins suckling, or that separating a calf for part of the day leaves milk available for people. None of this is documented as a single invention. It is a reconstruction based on how dairying works and on the evidence that communities were managing herds for more than meat. Milking itself is not as simple as locating the correct part of the animal and demonstrating enthusiasm. A cow may hold back milk when stressed, kick when annoyed, move at the worst possible moment, or reserve most of the supply for her calf. The herder has to control the animal without injuring it, keep the container relatively clean, and collect enough liquid to justify the risk. Early dairying was therefore not one discovery, but a cluster of techniques: animal handling, timing, calf management, storage, and the important art of standing where the hoof is least likely to arrive.
And even then, the practical question remains: who actually tried it? Perhaps a child tasted milk intended for a calf. Perhaps an adult copied what infants already did with human milk and decided the species boundary looked negotiable. Perhaps fresh milk spilled into a container, soured, and became less alarming after somebody noticed it had not killed the person who ate it yesterday. History often advances because one person is curious and another person is considered replaceable. So place yourself in the village. There is no germ theory, no knowledge of lactose, and one increasingly suspicious cow. Do you drink the first bowl yourself, give it to the bravest person, or nominate someone whose contribution to communal life has recently been disappointing? Put your choice in the comments. Somebody had to make the decision, and the cow was not participating in the vote. The earliest straying archaeological evidence does not identify a mouth, it identifies pots. Animal fats soak into porous pottery, and traces can survive for thousands of years. By analyzing particular fatty acids and their carbon isotope values, researchers can often distinguish dairy fats from the fats of an animal carcass. The result is less dramatic than finding a Neolithic cup engraved with first milk, but considerably more useful. Residues from pottery in northwestern Anatolia show that people were processing milk in the 7th millennium BCE, among some of the earliest farming communities using ceramics in that region. Evidence also appears in southeastern Europe and later across many parts of Europe as farming spread. This does not prove that one Anatolian individual was the first human ever to drink cow's milk. Earlier people may have used containers made from wood, skin, gourds, or baskets that left little trace. Archaeology is often a record of what survived, not a complete list of what happened. Pots are not the only witnesses. Milk proteins can become trapped in hardened dental plaque, surviving as calculus on ancient teeth. In some cases, those proteins provide direct evidence that a particular person consumed dairy and can even indicate the animal group involved. This is useful because a cooking pot proves that somebody processed milk nearby, while a tooth places the product inside an actual human mouth. It still does not reveal whether the person enjoyed the experience. Archaeology has limits. There is another complication. Chemical traces may reveal ruminant dairy without always telling us whether the milk came from cattle, sheep, or goats. Animal bones, herd composition, and slaughter patterns help narrow the possibilities. If many young males were killed while females survived longer, that can fit a system designed to keep milk-producing animals alive. It is not a signed confession from a dairy farmer, but prehistoric livestock rarely complete paperwork. Fresh milk also came with hazards beyond lactose. Without modern hygiene, it could collect dirt during milking, spoil quickly in warm weather, or carry pathogens from animals in containers. Heating may have reduced some risks, and fermentation could make the product more stable, but we cannot assume every community used the same method. The first bowl was not only a digestive experiment. It was an unlicensed microbiology trial conducted beside a cow. Now the story becomes biologically inconvenient. Most early European farmers probably could not digest large quantities of fresh milk comfortably as adults. After infancy, many humans reduce production of lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose. Without enough lactase, a heroic bowl of raw milk can produce bloating, cramps, and a rapid reassessment of personal ambition. The genetic variants associated with lactase persistence became common much later in some populations.
This means humans were exploiting dairy for thousands of years before many adults had the biological equipment that modern milk drinkers take for granted. The behavior came first. The genes followed unevenly, in different places and under selective pressures that researchers still debate. Evolution did not see humans drinking milk and immediately release a software update. For a long time, culture was operating with hardware that had not approved the installation. That sounds like a fatal flaw in the entire plan, but it probably helped create the most important part of the story. People did not need to consume all dairy as fresh milk. Leave milk alone for a while and microbes begin changing it. Managed carefully, that process produces sour milk, yogurt-like foods, curds, cheese, and other products with less lactose and a longer useful life. Managed badly, it produces a lesson with no written instructions. By the 6th millennium BCE, perforated pottery vessels in what is now Poland were being used to separate milk curds from whey. Fat residues in those strainers provide compelling evidence of cheese making. This was not merely a sophisticated way to improve breakfast. Removing much of the lactose-rich whey made dairy easier for many adults to tolerate, while turning a rapidly spoiling liquid into food that could be stored, carried, and divided. Here is the mid-story reversal. The first person to drink cow's milk may be less important than the first person who deliberately let it become something else. Fresh milk was seasonal, fragile, and biologically awkward. Fermented dairy was a technology. It converted a brief surplus from a lactating animal into a more dependable source of calories and nutrients. The village experiment had become food engineering, although the engineers were using clay pots, ambient bacteria, and confidence. Seasonality mattered.
Early cattle did not produce modern commercial quantities of milk throughout the year. Calving was often concentrated in particular seasons, and milk supply would rise and disappear with reproduction, grazing conditions, and the health of the herd. A community that could preserve milk as cheese was not just inventing a flavor, it was moving food through time, which is one of civilization's favorite tricks. This preservation skill also created choices about who received dairy and when. Children may have tolerated fresh milk better than many adults, while processed products could be shared more broadly. A small surplus might be eaten immediately. A larger one could become curds or cheese for later. Once milk could be delayed, divided, and transported, it stopped being merely something the cow produced that morning. It became something a household could plan around.
Dairying also changed the relationship between people and animals. Keeping females alive for repeated milk production alters which animals are slaughtered, how herds are managed, where people graze them, and how much labor is spent protecting calves from predators, weather, disease, and hungry neighbors. A cow was no longer simply meat waiting at an inconvenient distance. It had become renewable infrastructure with legs. The practice did not spread as one uniform package. Some early farming communities used dairy heavily, others used little or none. Different regions favored cattle, sheep, goats, or mixtures of all three. Climate, landscape, local tradition, available animals, and human digestion all mattered. There was no Neolithic headquarters issuing standards for acceptable cheese. Communities experimented, copied, abandoned techniques, and occasionally produced substances that would now require a specialist shop and a confident nose.
Later, genetic changes allowing adults to digest lactose became much more common in several pastoral populations, including parts of Europe and Africa, though the relevant variants and histories were not identical. Why those traits became so advantageous is still investigated. Fresh milk could provide fluid and nutrition, dairying could help during shortages, and the costs of poor digestion may have become more severe during famine or disease. The broad point is clear, even when the exact evolutionary route is not. Milk changed human behavior, and human behavior changed the frequency of genes. By then, the original act had generated an entire system. Herds shaped landscapes, dairy products became foods, trade goods, traditions, status markers, and arguments about smell. Milk moved from a calf's private supply to a resource processed in households and communities. Much later, it would be measured, regulated, bottled, advertised, refrigerated, flavored, foamed, and offered in enough varieties to make ordering coffee feel like an administrative hearing. So, who was the first person to drink cow's milk? We cannot identify them, and we probably should not imagine a single inventor standing alone while the village watched. Dairying was more likely a chain of observations and experiments. People living beside domesticated animals, handling calves, collecting small amounts, tasting them, souring them, processing them, and gradually learning which results were food and which results were consequences.
The first drinker may have been a child. The first adult may have taken only a cautious sip. The first useful dairy product may have been fermented almost by accident. What survives is not the heroic moment, but the expanding pattern. Milk fats in pottery, herd management choices in bones, proteins in human teeth, and eventually genetic evidence showing that bodies began adapting to a practice culture had already made important. That anonymous experiment still sits in your refrigerator. Every carton of milk and every piece of cheese is the distant result of people refusing to leave a cow's reproductive biology as a private matter. The first person did not know they were beginning dairying. They were simply standing near a large animal with a container and an idea. History has been living with the consequences ever since.